He found the gun among the oranges, and they were taken away in handcuffs. But at the police station, the truth came out, shocking everyone. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The sun was just beginning to rise over the quiet suburb when Marcus and Evelyn Johnson pulled into the supermarket parking lot. Sunday mornings were their ritual. For years, they had turned grocery shopping into a small ceremony, a way to start the week together. The air was cool, carrying the faint smell of freshly cut grass from a nearby lawn service, and the asphalt still glistened from the night's light drizzle. Evelyn smoothed the front of her summer dress as they walked side by side toward the automatic glass doors, Marcus pushing a cart with a calm, practiced rhythm. There was something comforting about the routine, the way the hum of the store seemed to greet them like a familiar voice. Inside, the fluorescent lights glowed white and clean. A faint melody of pop music played over the speakers, broken now and then by announcements about daily specials. Children chattered as their parents loaded cereal and milk into carts. An elderly couple debated over which bread was fresher, and the whole place carried the quiet buzz of weekend life. Evelyn smiled softly, letting herself relax. She loved this part of the week, when things felt predictable and safe. They headed straight to the produce section. The display was carefully arranged, pyramids of apples, stacks of melons, mountains of oranges glowing like small suns. The air smelled of citrus and freshly misted lettuce. Evelyn reached for a few bright oranges, lifting each one as if weighing them for perfection. Marcus leaned casually against the cart, watching her with a fond half-smile. There was nothing unusual about the morning, nothing that hinted at what was about to happen. When Marcus reached into the wooden crate to help her, he noticed something odd. One of the oranges felt heavier, colder, almost too perfect. He frowned, turned it in his hand, and realized it wasn't quite right. The skin felt faintly artificial, smooth in a way real fruit never was. Curious, he shifted a few more oranges aside, and that was when he saw the glint. It was small at first, a glimmer of metal under the pile of fruit, but it stopped him cold. His stomach tightened. He reached in carefully, his fingers closing around the object. When he pulled it free, he was no longer holding fruit but a pistol. It was black, heavy, its serial number filed away. For a long moment he just stared at it, frozen. The noise of the store seemed to fall away, replaced by the rush of blood in his ears. He knew what holding a weapon like this meant. Years ago, as a sergeant on the force, he had handled dozens like it. Confiscated guns, guns tied to robberies and shootings, guns taken from the hands of desperate men. But never here. Not like this. Evelyn's voice broke through his trance. She had turned to grab another bag of fruit and froze when she saw what was in his hand. Her eyes widened, a flash of fear crossing her face, not because of Marcus, but because of what this would look like to everyone else. Around them, other shoppers began to notice. A woman nearby gasped and pulled her child closer, whispering sharply. A man in a business suit muttered something under his breath about people bringing this kind of trouble everywhere. The quiet buzz of the store was replaced by murmurs, by the unmistakable sound of phones being raised and cameras turning toward them. Marcus felt the weight of every stare pressing into his back. Then the manager appeared. He was a tall man in a pressed shirt and name badge, his face red with anger, or perhaps relief at having a scapegoat so quickly. He pointed at Marcus and shouted that this was unacceptable, that he had known something like this would happen. He accused Marcus of bringing a weapon into the store, his voice rising so everyone could hear. Before Marcus could explain, a security guard rushed over. The man grabbed his wrist roughly, twisting it behind his back. The pistol clattered to the floor among the scattered oranges, a jarring sound that seemed to seal the judgment already forming in everyone's mind. Evelyn stepped forward, trying to speak, but the guard shoved her aside. Her purse fell, spilling items across the shiny floor. The sound of sirens came moments later. Red and blue lights flashed through the wide front windows, painting the scene in a surreal glow. Police officers entered quickly, hands near their holsters, voices commanding and firm. Marcus tried to speak, but they had already decided what they saw. A black man in a supermarket, a gun on the floor, a frightened crowd. They handcuffed him while Evelyn protested, tears threatening to spill, but her voice steady. The officers didn't listen. One of them took Evelyn by the arm and led her toward the door. Customers stood aside, whispering, some with their phones raised to record every step. The cart they had been filling with groceries was left abandoned. Oranges rolled away across the tiles, some coming to rest against the wheels of the cart, some lying near the pistol that had started it all. To the watching crowd, it looked like the end of a crime scene, neat and tidy. To Marcus and Evelyn, it felt like the end of something much deeper. As they were led out through the main doors, Marcus felt the hot morning air hit his face. The parking lot seemed brighter than before, too bright. Somewhere deep inside him, a simmering anger began to take shape. He had done nothing wrong, and yet here he was, paraded in front of strangers, as if he had. In the back of the police car, he caught Evelyn's eye through the glass between them. She looked pale but resolute. He straightened his shoulders. Whatever this was, whatever game was being played, they would face it together. The car pulled away from the supermarket, the crowd's murmurs fading into the distance, the flashing lights reflected in the rearview mirror, and Marcus closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe evenly. He knew where they were going. He had been there before, on the other side of the desk, in uniform, holding the power. Now he would be on the receiving end. And as the car turned onto the main road, a single thought burned in his mind. Someone had put that gun there, and whoever it was had just made a very big mistake. The ride to the police station was silent except for the crackle of the radio. Marcus sat with his hands cuffed behind his back, staring straight ahead, his jaw tight. The car smelled faintly of vinyl and disinfectant, the same smell he remembered from his years on the force. Evelyn sat in another vehicle behind them, her silhouette visible through the rear window, motionless except for the turn of her head whenever she could catch a glimpse of him. The city outside passed in fragments, strip malls, quiet intersections, pedestrians pausing to watch the small convoy of flashing lights. And Marcus felt the burn of humiliation in every flash of color. When they arrived, the station loomed gray and impersonal against the pale morning sky. It was a place Marcus had once considered a second home, but now its blank concrete facade felt cold and foreign. The officers moved quickly, ushering him through the side entrance, down a corridor that smelled of strong cleaning chemicals and something faintly metallic. They separated him from Evelyn almost immediately, leading her toward another hallway. She glanced back over her shoulder once, her expression tight but determined. Inside the holding area, Marcus was guided to a metal chair bolted to the floor. The room was small, with cinder-block walls painted a color that might have been white once, but had since faded to a dull gray. A single fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glare that made every shadow seem deeper. The cuffs were finally removed, but the gesture did little to ease the tension building in his chest. The door opened again, and a detective entered, carrying a folder. He was middle-aged, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows, a faint trace of weariness in his eyes. He sat across the table and began asking questions, his tone measured, but firm. Where had Marcus gotten the weapon? Why was he holding it? Did he have a permit? Was he connected to any of the burglaries that had been reported nearby? Each question was delivered as though the answer was already known, as though the detective was simply waiting for Marcus to confirm his suspicions. Marcus listened carefully, choosing his words with precision. Years of experience taught him that anger would only make things worse. He kept his voice level, explaining that he had simply found the gun among the oranges, that he had been as shocked as anyone. The detective's pen scratched across the notepad, the sound sharp and deliberate, but his expression betrayed little. Marcus could feel the weight of judgment pressing on him, the silent assumption that he must be lying because the alternative, that a gun had been left in the produce aisle of a major supermarket, was too strange to accept. In another room, Evelyn sat at a similar table. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to sit upright, to breathe evenly. The officer questioning her was younger, his tone softer, but no less probing. He asked about their schedule that morning, about whether they had had conflicts in the neighborhood, whether Marcus had ever owned a firearm. Evelyn's mind worked quickly, recalling the details of their morning step by step, knowing that consistency would be crucial. She could feel the humiliation creeping in, the awareness that somewhere out there, people were already sharing the video of their arrest, turning them into a spectacle before the truth could be told. Hours seemed to pass in slow motion. Marcus was left alone more than once, sitting in the humming silence of the room, replaying the scene at the supermarket in his mind. He pictured the pistol lying among the scattered fruit, the expression on the manager's face, the way the crowd had parted, as though he were dangerous. It was too perfect, too convenient. Someone had put that gun there, and the manager's eagerness to accuse them still echoed in his thoughts. At last the detective returned, looking at the file as if something in it had shifted his perception. Marcus could sense the change. The questions became less pointed, more procedural. It was as if the detective was no longer entirely certain of the story he had been given. When he asked Marcus about his occupation, Marcus explained his years as a sergeant, the commendations he had received, the cases he had closed. The detective paused at that, the pen hovering over the paper for a moment, before he nodded slowly. Across the building, Evelyn found her own strength returning as she remembered her work in the crime lab years ago. She described chain of custody procedures, fingerprint analysis, surveillance review, all the methods she knew could clear them if the department chose to use them. There was a glint in her eye now, a quiet defiance that had not been there at first. By late afternoon, the station had settled into its usual rhythm. Phones rang in the distance. Officers moved back and forth through the hallways. The smell of stale coffee drifted in from somewhere near the front desk. Marcus felt a shift inside himself, a decision forming. If the system was going to put him through this, then he would force it to do its job properly. He asked for the surveillance footage from the supermarket to be pulled, for the gun to be dusted for prints. He knew exactly which procedures to invoke and which requests would be difficult for them to deny. Evelyn, escorted past the holding area on her way back from questioning, caught his eye for the briefest moment. There was no need for words. The look they exchanged was enough. They were united. Whatever was coming next, they would face it together, just as they had in every other trial life had thrown at them. In the corridors of the station, some officers exchanged glances, whispering about the case. There was talk of the supermarket's manager, of how quickly he had placed the blame, of how strange it was that a loaded pistol had been left where children could reach it. Doubt was spreading, even if no one said so aloud. When evening came, the rooms were quieter, the harsh light softer somehow. Marcus sat alone at the table, feeling the day's exhaustion settle into his bones, but there was no despair in him now. There was anger, yes, but there was also resolve. The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered, and he intended to make sure they found it. Somewhere in the same building, Evelyn sat on a narrow bench, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She thought about their neighborhood, their friends, their families, and how this day would be remembered. She decided, right then, that if they were cleared, when they were cleared, she would not allow the world to simply move on. This was bigger than them now. It was about how easily lives could be broken by suspicion, how quickly dignity could be stripped away. As the clock neared midnight, a door opened down the hall, and footsteps approached. The detective reappeared, his expression unreadable, but there was something different in his stance. Something was shifting. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, and the next hours would determine whether Marcus and Evelyn walked out of this building free, or whether the weight of false accusation would press down even harder. For now, they waited, side by side in separate rooms, with the same thought in their minds. The truth had to be found, no matter what it cost. The next morning brought a heavy stillness to the station. The hum of air conditioning and the faint shuffle of paperwork were the only sounds that marked the slow passage of time. Marcus had barely slept in the hard-backed chair where they had left him. His mind had been restless, circling back to the image of the gun lying among the oranges, the accusing glare of the manager, and the look in Evelyn's eyes that told him she was ready to fight. When the detective finally entered the room again, carrying a tablet and a stack of forms, Marcus could sense a subtle shift. There was less suspicion in the man's expression now, more focus, as though he had begun to see the case as something deeper than a simple arrest. He was told that the department had decided to review the surveillance footage from the supermarket in full. Marcus nodded, feeling a grim satisfaction. This was the first step toward the truth. He asked about the gun, and the detective confirmed that it had been sent to the lab for prints. The words brought Evelyn to his mind again. She would have approved of that move, knowing how crucial such evidence could be. By late morning, Marcus and Evelyn were escorted together into a small viewing room where a monitor had been set up. The footage played in silence, grainy but clear enough to make out shapes and faces. They watched as the previous night unfolded on screen, workers wheeling in crates of produce, stacking them neatly, the aisles quiet and the after-hours calm. Then came the moment that froze everyone in the room. The manager himself, entering the stock area alone, moving with quick, almost furtive precision. He dragged in a box that looked like it had been taped shut hastily, glanced over his shoulder twice, and then shoved it behind a stack of legitimate inventory. Hours later, other employees came in to begin stocking for the morning rush, and in the chaos of moving boxes from the cooler to the display floor, one of the unmarked boxes was mistakenly sent out with the rest. The detective paused the video, leaning back in his chair, his brow furrowed. The conclusion was becoming inescapable. It was not Marcus or Evelyn who had brought danger into that store. The danger had been sitting there all along, hidden among the food meant to feed families. That afternoon, a small team of officers was sent to the supermarket to conduct a full search of the storeroom. Marcus was not allowed to accompany them, but he imagined every step of their work as he sat waiting, Evelyn beside him. She held his hand quietly, her fingers warm against his, her presence a steady anchor. Hours passed before the team returned, their faces marked by the kind of grim discovery that left no room for doubt. They had found more weapons. 3 additional pistols were recovered, wrapped in plastic, and wedged deep between pallets of produce. Beneath a false bottom in one of the crates, they had discovered a stash of ammunition and a ledger filled with cryptic notations, dates, quantities, initials that seemed to correspond to shipments. It was no accident, no coincidence. This was a smuggling operation, and the supermarket had been one of its waypoints. When Marcus heard the news, he felt a mixture of vindication and rage. Vindication, because the truth was coming to light. Rage, because they had been paraded through the store like criminals, humiliated in front of strangers, when all along the real criminal had been hiding behind a badge of authority and the title of manager. Evelyn squeezed his hand, her expression unreadable, but he saw the fire in her eyes. Later that evening, the manager was brought into the station for questioning. Through the narrow window of the holding area, Marcus caught a glimpse of him, his neat shirt now rumpled, his face slick with sweat. There was none of the confidence he had displayed in the store, none of the righteous indignation. The man was pale, his eyes darting back and forth, as though searching for a way out. The questioning stretched late into the night. The officers laid out the evidence piece by piece, the footage, the recovered weapons, the ledger. At first, the manager denied everything, claiming he was simply moving inventory, that someone else must have hidden the guns. But the evidence was overwhelming. Each new piece tightened the noose. When they presented the records from his phone, text messages coordinating deliveries with unnamed contacts, his defiance crumbled. He confessed that he had been approached months earlier by people who offered him money to let certain shipments pass through unnoticed. At first it had seemed easy, harmless even, just letting boxes sit in the storeroom for a day or two before someone came to retrieve them. But soon the shipments began to include weapons, and he had grown fearful. The last delivery had come earlier than expected, and in his haste, he had stashed the box wherever he could, not realizing that the next morning crew would place it on the sales floor. As Marcus listened to the detective recounting the confession, he felt the knot in his chest begin to loosen. The truth was out. The manager would be charged, the weapons confiscated, the smuggling ring dismantled piece by piece. Yet the victory felt bittersweet. Nothing could erase the image of Evelyn being led out of the store in tears, of the strangers recording their shame as though it were entertainment. When the formal exoneration papers were finally prepared, Marcus and Evelyn were allowed to sit together in one of the quieter rooms of the station. The fluorescent light above flickered slightly, and the sound of distant phones had faded as night settled in. Evelyn leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. For the first time since the ordeal began, Marcus felt the tension leave his body. But as they sat in silence, he realized this wasn't the end. The public had seen their arrest, but would they see their release? Would they see the truth, or would the first image, the image of them in handcuffs, be the one that stayed in people's minds? When the officers came to tell them they could go home, Marcus stood slowly, every muscle sore from the long hours of waiting. Evelyn gathered her things, her movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. Together they walked down the hallway toward the exit. On the way, they passed the manager, now sitting behind the glass of a holding cell. He avoided their eyes, staring at the floor. Outside, the air was cooler than the night before. The parking lot was quiet, empty except for their car waiting under the yellow glow of a street lamp. Marcus unlocked the door for Evelyn, then stood for a moment looking up at the dark sky. There were stars faintly visible, distant and cold, and he felt a strange sense of resolve. This was bigger than them now. The truth was on their side, but the story wasn't over. Somewhere beyond this quiet parking lot, there were still people who needed to know what had happened, people who needed to see how quickly judgment had been passed, and Marcus intended to make sure they did. He slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove them home. The road ahead was empty, the city lights stretching out in the distance. Beside him, Evelyn sat with her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the windshield. Neither of them spoke, but they didn't need to. The next chapter of their fight was already taking shape, waiting for them just beyond the horizon. The morning after their release came with a muted light that filtered through the curtains of their small home, casting long, pale rectangles across the floor. Marcus sat at the kitchen table, staring at the untouched mug of coffee in front of him, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator. The house felt at once safe and fragile, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath after what had happened. Evelyn moved slowly around the kitchen, tidying absent-mindedly, but her mind was clearly elsewhere. The silence between them was not cold. It was heavy, full of thoughts neither had yet put into words. When the phone rang, they both startled. Evelyn answered, and a moment later handed the receiver to Marcus. It was the detective, his voice formal, but carrying a note of something almost like respect. The case against them had been fully closed. The department was preparing an official statement clearing their names. The manager had been charged with multiple counts related to illegal possession, distribution, and conspiracy. There would be a press release later in the day. Marcus thanked him and set the phone down. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. It was what he had wanted to hear, and yet it did not bring the relief he expected. Their names might be cleared on paper, but the memory of the supermarket, of the crowd watching, of the strangers with their phones out, could not be erased by a press release. By mid-afternoon, the story had already broken on the local news. A reporter stood in front of the supermarket, microphone in hand, narrating how a routine morning had turned into the exposure of a smuggling ring. The footage from the surveillance camera was played for viewers, showing the manager sneaking the box into the storeroom. Then came the images of police carrying crates of confiscated weapons to their vehicles. It was undeniable proof of what had really happened. But it was not just the local station. Social media lit up with clips and commentary. Some of the same videos that had been posted of Marcus and Evelyn being escorted out of the store were now reposted with captions that told the real story. They had been innocent all along. Comment threads were filled with outrage, not just at the manager, but at the way the couple had been treated, the way they had been assumed guilty on sight. People questioned why the police had acted so quickly, why the manager's word had been enough to justify such public humiliation. Evelyn watched the coverage with her arms folded tightly across her chest. She felt a cold, clear determination settle over her. This was bigger than just clearing their names. There was a system here that needed to be confronted, a pattern that had to be broken. She thought of every person who had not had the chance to prove their innocence, every story that had not ended with an investigation and a confession. That evening, a journalist from one of the city's larger papers called, asking if they would be willing to share their side of the story. Evelyn agreed without hesitation. Marcus hesitated, but then nodded too. The interview was arranged for the next morning. When the reporter arrived, she was young, earnest, her notepad ready. She asked them to recount everything from the moment they entered the supermarket. Marcus spoke carefully, his voice steady as he described the crate, the discovery of the gun, the crowd's reaction, the rough grip of the security guard. Evelyn added her own memories, the sound of her purse hitting the floor, the look on her husband's face as they were led away. The reporter took notes quickly, occasionally looking up with a frown as the full picture came together. When the article was published 2 days later, it spread quickly. The headline focused on injustice, on the dangers of rushing to judgment. Photos of Marcus and Evelyn, standing together on their porch, arms linked, appeared beside paragraphs that detailed the collapse of the smuggling operation and the confession of the manager. The paper's editorial board wrote a piece about the importance of due process and the consequences of bias in public spaces. Strangers began leaving messages of support on their front step, small notes tucked under the doormat, flowers left on the porch. Friends from the neighborhood came by to apologize for not speaking up sooner, for believing the worst even for a moment. Marcus accepted the apologies with a polite nod, but in private he admitted to Evelyn that it would take time for the sting to fade. Weeks later, they were invited to speak at a community forum organized by local activists. At first, Marcus resisted. He was tired of reliving the incident, tired of being the center of attention. But Evelyn convinced him. This was not just about them anymore. This was about making sure others would not go through the same ordeal. The forum was held in a modest community center, folding chairs set up in rows, the smell of coffee and paper lingering in the air. People filled the room, some familiar, many strangers. When Marcus stood at the podium, he felt a hush settle over the crowd. He spoke slowly, carefully, telling the story from beginning to end, letting the weight of each moment rest in the silence that followed. Evelyn followed, her words sharper, filled with a quiet fury that drew murmurs of agreement from the audience. When it was over, people lined up to thank them, to shake their hands, to promise that they would remember. Marcus and Evelyn left the center that night with a strange mix of exhaustion and hope. The road ahead would still be long. There were lawsuits to be considered, reforms to advocate for, but they had turned their pain into something larger than themselves. Months later, the supermarket reopened under new management. Marcus and Evelyn drove by one afternoon but did not go inside. The memory was too fresh, the image of the oranges scattered on the floor too vivid. Yet as they sat in the car, watching families walk in and out with their groceries, Marcus felt a measure of peace. The truth had come out. The people who had tried to break them had failed. As the sun set, they drove home slowly, the golden light spilling across the road ahead. Evelyn reached over and took Marcus's hand. Neither spoke. They did not need to. The ordeal had changed them, sharpened them, but it had not broken them. And as long as they stood together, they knew they could face whatever came next. If this story kept you watching until the end, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch our other stories. There's more waiting for you right now. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some stories are too powerful to keep to yourself.